The Catalina Foothills are a fortress of manicured lawns and heavy gates, but on January 31st, 2026, that desert silence was transformed into a tactical advantage. A high-frequency ringtone shattered the stillness inside a darkened bedroom at exactly 1:44 a.m. in North Tucson. The timing was clinically precise. The vibration sliced through the pitch-black room with lethal intent. This was not a random interference, an accidental notification, or a late-night misdial. There was no error in the dialing sequence. The caller possessed the target's direct coordinates and understood the exact kinetic sequence about to follow. 180 seconds later, the digital security eye went blind. This is the timeline of Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old mother. She exited her daughter's residence into the cold January air on that final Saturday, and the woman the world knew simply evaporated into the shadows. Tension boiled over at the Pima County Sheriff's Department as a formal vote of no confidence was leveled against Chris Nanos this week. Internal union data suggests a staggering 50% of active duty deputies are now demanding the immediate resignation of their top commander. Brian, our senior national correspondent, has tracked the Guthrie forensic trail since the initial missing persons report was filed. We need to understand how this administrative collapse at the Pima County Sheriff's Department is impacting the active search for Guthrie. When investigators began dissecting the digital metadata of that solitary phone call, they exposed a fracture in the neighborhood's perceived security. Every suburban metric suggested safety, yet the evidence pointed toward a calculated predation that none of the affluent residents had predicted. Nancy's Saturday followed a rigid domestic pattern. She prioritized family proximity, maintaining a schedule that was predictable to anyone watching closely. At 5:32 p.m., she summoned a rideshare vehicle for the 4-mile transit to her daughter Annie's home in the foothills. The commute was unremarkable, ending at the doorstep of Annie and her husband, Tommaso Cione, who were waiting for their scheduled guest. They shared a standard evening meal, the atmosphere dictated by decades of family tradition, predictable, comforting, and seemingly devoid of any external threat. The visit concluded in the narrow window between 9:30 and 9:45 p.m. as the desert temperature began to drop. Tommaso provided the return transport instead of a hired car. They reached Nancy's driveway at 9:48 p.m. precisely. 2 minutes later, at 9:50 p.m., the motorized garage door sealed her inside. That specific digit would become a pivot point for the FBI. For the next 4 hours, the house was a dead zone. No motion sensors triggered, no lights flickered, no biometric data indicated a disturbance. To a casual observer, the residence was a tomb of quietude. Detectives, however, viewed this window as a period of active predatory staging. As the clock ticked past midnight on January 31st, the absence of sound became a weapon used against the unsuspecting 84-year-old woman. The silence in that upscale hallway was a tactical choice, a void waiting to be filled by the specific violence of the coming hour. The psychological weight of a late-night call depends entirely on the identity of the caller. Trust is the ultimate vulnerability in a secure home. Forensic logs confirm that at 1:44 a.m., Nancy's phone registered its final incoming transmission before the service was permanently terminated. The caller was no ghost or telemarketer. The device recognized the number immediately, linking it to a person Nancy considered a permanent fixture in her life. 43 seconds after the line went dead, the environment changed. The predatory cycle moved from the digital realm into physical space. At 1:47 a.m., a figure wearing a facial obstruction materialized within the frame of the front door's optical sensor. The intruder's gait showed zero hesitation. There was no scanning for obstacles, no fumbling with the lock, no uncertainty regarding the interior floor plan. This individual operated with the muscle memory of someone who had walked these halls frequently or had memorized a stolen blueprint. The aftermath of the camera's deactivation left a dark window that technicians spent weeks illuminating through a complex web of secondary evidence. They synced data from a cardiac pacemaker, regional cell towers, and a frantic 911 call placed by a passing motorist. Further evidence arrived from a Ring camera 5 miles distant, which captured a fleeting, high-resolution image of a vehicle that shouldn't have been there. In corporate strategy, aggressive timelines are often moved forward without warning. Here, the predator accelerated their schedule to exploit a sudden opportunity. By the time the FBI assumed jurisdiction, they weren't investigating a spontaneous disappearance, but a high-precision abduction executed with military-grade timing. This operation was birthed months prior to that 1:44 a.m. call, requiring an intimate knowledge of Nancy's daily movements and personal contacts. The assailant knew her entry codes, her bedroom location, and the specific weaknesses of a home designed for comfort rather than defense. Embedded within the cold logic of the kidnapping was a singular, devastating truth that narrowed the suspect pool to a few close associates. The entire Tucson investigation hinged on the identity of the person who initiated that final, fatal communication from within her trusted circle. This case remains a masterclass in forensic documentation, leaving behind a trail of evidence that is as haunting as it is mathematically precise. The investigation reveals that the most dangerous threats don't lurk in the shadows, but sit at our dinner tables waiting for the clock. Every piece of data, from the pacemaker's final beat to the cell tower's handshake, tells a story of a betrayal that cannot be ignored. We are looking at a scenario where safety was an illusion and the person holding the door open was the one who locked it. The evidence suggests a level of intimacy that turns a simple missing persons case into a clinical study of human depravity. As the sun rose over the Catalina Foothills, the reality of what happened to Nancy Guthrie was only beginning to emerge from the shadows. The digital trail pulled from encrypted mobile records by the Bureau revealed a calculated predatory sequence that the residents of this Tucson enclave were entirely unprepared to confront. At 9:50 p.m., the garage door's motor whined to a halt, initiating a 3-hour and 54-minute vacuum of sound where the environment surrounding Nancy Guthrie's residence remained frozen. The Catalina Foothills are defined by a specific brand of desert isolation, a costly, manufactured stillness that the local elite purchased to ensure their distance from the chaos of the city. Not a single siren disturbed the dry air. No unauthorized motion tripped the sensors, and no external indicators suggested that the interior of the home had become a crime scene. Forensic experts later argued that this total lack of acoustic disturbance was the first forensic anomaly, suggesting a stalker had already established a silent tactical vantage point. To dissect the clinical reality of the subsequent hours, one must first analyze the highly structured, low-risk environment that Nancy Guthrie had spent decades cultivating. This particular quadrant of the foothills isn't a place where security is neglected. Doors remain locked not out of fear, but as part of a rigid, upper-class suburban protocol. The neighborhood functions on a system of predictable rhythms and the quiet psychological assurance that every vehicle and pedestrian in the cul-de-sac belongs there. For an 84-year-old widow living in isolation, this predictability wasn't just a lifestyle choice, it was the vital architecture that sustained her physical safety. Nancy relied on a walker for mobility, meticulously sorted her own pharmaceutical regimen, and maintained a calendar that left zero room for spontaneous interruptions. She was an individual defined by precision, a woman who never delegated her autonomy to strangers and moved through her home with a calculated rhythmic intentionality. Her world was a fortress of habit with a very small list of cleared personnel, a psychological profile that made any deviation from the norm an immediate, lethal vulnerability. When federal agents began the forensic reconstruction of January 31st, the data immediately discarded any theory of a random, opportunistic home invasion. The intruder possessed a granular level of operational intelligence, specifically regarding the exact minute she would pull into her driveway and the certainty of her solitude. This individual understood the blind spots of the property's surveillance, moving with enough anatomical knowledge to disable a camera before a single motion alert could be triggered. The evidence points to a perpetrator who didn't just stumble upon Nancy. They had studied her, mapped her movements, and likely stood in her presence before. Federal investigators have focused their scrutiny on 3 specific calendar dates, data points that have been publicly noted but whose lethal significance remains misunderstood by the public. Their interest wasn't based on a general profile or a broad demographic search, but on a specific, hauntingly intimate knowledge of her biological and social clock. They were aware of her weekend rituals, knowing that every Saturday evening was reserved for her daughter, a piece of intelligence that allowed them to time their arrival perfectly. They knew Tommaso would provide the transportation, they knew the exact 9:50 p.m. timestamp of the garage closure, and they knew the heavy silence that would follow. They understood that once that door locked, she was a captive of her own routine. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, but a crime of total environmental and psychological access. The focus shifted to a narrow list of individuals who possessed the security codes, the keys, or the familiarity required to bypass her defensive layers without a struggle. The roster was composed of people who had sat at her table, people who knew her medication times, and people whose digital footprints were already etched into her personal history. As that list of suspects contracted, the weight of suspicion on the remaining names became suffocating, even as the physical evidence outside began to paint a brutal picture. On the porch, the exact spot where the digital eye of the doorbell camera was cut at 1:47 a.m., investigators identified microscopic droplets of human hemoglobin. These stains weren't found in the living room or scattered on the sidewalk. They were localized precisely at the primary threshold, the thin line between safety and the intruder. The splatter was concentrated at the entry point, positioned exactly where a resident would stand to greet a familiar face or an expected guest in the early morning hours. The geometry of the blood evidence is devastating. It confirms that the barrier wasn't breached by a crowbar or a heavy boot, but was likely opened from the inside. There were no shattered glass panes, no splintered door frames, and no signs of a struggle at the rear of the estate. The house remained a sealed, undisturbed tomb. The logic leads to a singular, terrifying conclusion. Nancy Guthrie opened her door willingly at 1:47 a.m. to someone she believed she could trust. At 1:52 a.m., while the Guthrie home was falling into a deeper darkness, a different sensor 5 miles away captured a flickering, low-resolution anomaly. This secondary camera, located in a separate residential zone, recorded a male figure clutching multiple backpacks while desperately fumbling with a perimeter gate. His movements were erratic and fueled by a high cortisol panic, yet he maintained a frantic, singular focus as if a countdown was ticking in the back of his mind. Analysts calculated that a vehicle traveling from the foothills at that hour could cover those 5 miles in exactly 8 minutes, creating a tight, damning temporal association. The clock was the silent witness. 5 miles, 8 minutes, and a man fleeing the scene with stolen property. The variables were aligning into a lethal equation. While these fragments didn't yet form a confession, the geometric convergence of the data points was pulling the investigation toward a solitary, horrific conclusion. Within the master bedroom, a piece of high-tech medical equipment was silently recording the final biological data of a human life in real time. Nancy's pacemaker was more than a medical necessity. It was a digital witness, logging every electrical pulse and every desperate surge of her cardiovascular system. The extracted logs revealed a harrowing 41-minute window that began the exact second the porch camera was severed, documenting a period of extreme physiological trauma. Her heart rate spiked to critical levels, showing the irregular, jagged patterns of a body locked in a state of terminal, unmitigated physical terror. This medical data acts as an indisputable forensic record, a silent testimony that no defense attorney can cross-examine and no alibi can successfully erase. At precisely 2:28 a.m., the transmission went flat, not a tapering off or a battery failure, but a sudden, absolute termination of the signal. 2:28 a.m. on February 1st, 2026 is the exact moment the investigation stopped being a search for a missing person and became a hunt for a killer. That timestamp marks the definitive end of Nancy Guthrie's biological existence, leaving investigators to determine if the signal cut because of distance or because her heart finally gave out. It remains the single most haunting data point in the file, a precise moment of expiration that leaves only one question. What was the last thing Nancy Guthrie saw before the pulse stopped? The heart had stopped, but the lithium-powered circuitry was still testifying, providing a cold, binary record of a life's final rhythm that investigators spent weeks scrutinizing with clinical intensity. This electronic pulse, however, was only one part of the forensic ghost haunting the crime scene. Within that same window of pre-dawn darkness, a desperate 911 frequency hit a dispatcher's console from the Catalina Foothills. A passing motorist reported the jagged sound of a woman's voice elevated, saturated with a visceral, primal distress, ripping through the silence from inside a vehicle moving at high speed through the shadows. Dispatchers logged the call precisely, and the spatial data aligned perfectly with the suspected timeline of the abduction, giving investigators a geographic anchor point that shifted the investigation's center of gravity. When forensic teams cross-referenced this auditory evidence with the digital breadcrumbs, it added a heavy layer of confirmation to a narrative that was rapidly expanding into a complex, multi-jurisdictional nightmare. A standard missing persons report was insufficient to describe the reality. Nancy Guthrie was a woman of rigid, predictable habits, and she had not simply wandered into the desert night or suffered a physical collapse. The evidence rejected the typical theories of geriatric disorientation. She had not vanished into the quiet, everyday fog that sometimes settles over the lives of 84-year-olds living in isolated suburban environments. Her removal from the home was a calculated predatory act executed by an individual who had mapped out the blind spots of her security cameras and understood the exact timing of the neighborhood's deepest sleep. Investigators recognized that the perpetrator had exploited a specific tactical window where her absence would remain undetected, prompting them to move beyond the theory of a random, disorganized crime. The central focus shifted from the mechanics of the disappearance to the identity of the architect behind the plan, searching for the mind that had orchestrated such a clean, surgical extraction from a locked residence. The answer was not in the shadows outside, but buried within a mobile device sitting in Nancy's quiet home, a device that should have been an inert piece of plastic but was instead holding a digital confession. Every byte of data retrieved from that device began to paint a psychological profile of the perpetrator, revealing a level of premeditation that suggested a deep, unsettling familiarity with the victim's daily existence. The silence of the Guthrie residence was deceptive, masking the digital trail of a predator who had monitored the home's frequencies and bypassed its defenses with the confidence of someone who belonged there. As local authorities hit the limits of their resources, the transition to federal oversight became inevitable, moving the case into a high-stakes arena of sophisticated signals, intelligence, and psychological mapping. The phone's stationary status should have been a certainty, yet the logistical reality of the investigation was about to be shattered by a signal that defied every law of the physical scene. Nancy Guthrie was missing. Her residence was a cordoned-off crime scene, her doorbell cameras had been manually deactivated, and her pacemaker had recorded its final beat at exactly 2:28 in the morning. Despite the house being under police guard, the missing woman's phone suddenly generated a new location handshake days later, appearing on a tower far from the Tucson city limits or the foothills. The digital ping originated from a device approximately 200 miles away from the primary scene, a geographic leap that signaled a massive escalation in the technical complexity of the perpetrator's movements. This 84-year-old woman's phone, which should have been sitting undisturbed in a house she would never see again, had somehow traveled across the state line in a silent, high-speed transit. That single coordinate forced a total forensic pivot because consumer electronics do not teleport. The movement required a physical actor to possess, transport, and activate the device in a new sector. Either a suspect had breached the secured crime scene to retrieve the device after the initial search, or the phone had been strategically removed during the primary abduction and kept powered down until that moment. The initial sweep of the Guthrie home had clearly overlooked a critical piece of evidence, or the perpetrator was bold enough to return to the site of the crime while under the heat of a statewide search. Both scenarios pointed toward a single terrifying truth. The individual responsible was not running in a panic, but was instead operating with a calculated, almost taunting level of logistical confidence. They had either remained in the vicinity, watching the police tape from the shadows, or they had never truly severed their connection to the crime scene they created in the early morning hours. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's entry into the case was a direct response to the sophistication of the planning and the deliberate use of technology to mask the trail across multiple jurisdictions. The sheer geographic reach of the phone's signal, combined with the perpetrator's ability to manipulate home security systems, placed this case far outside the standard operational capabilities of local sheriff departments. Federal agents began the grueling process of pulling specialized records, utilizing tools like high-resolution cell tower triangulation and origin analysis that provided a more granular look at the regional digital traffic. They constructed a comprehensive map of every bit and byte that had moved through the airwaves near the foothills on the night of January 31st, looking for the one signal that didn't belong. The records revealed a detail far more incriminating and specific than the task force had dared to hope for, hidden within the logs of a call placed to Nancy's landline. At 1:44 in the morning, a call had reached the house, and it hadn't originated from a burner phone or a masked internet protocol address that would be impossible for agents to trace. The incoming number was already cataloged in Nancy's personal contacts, associated with a person she viewed as a trusted confidant, someone whose voice would have been a source of comfort rather than alarm. Using advanced signal processing, investigators triangulated the exact position of the caller's handset at the precise moment the connection was established, narrowing the search to a specific neighborhood. The coordinates placed the caller within a tight geographic radius of the Guthrie home, situated perfectly to reach her front door within the narrow timeline established by the pacemaker's failure. This revelation fundamentally reclassified the nature of the crime, shifting the profile from a random home invasion to a targeted, intimate betrayal by someone within Nancy's inner circle. The investigation was no longer hunting for a nameless drifter or a random opportunist. They were now looking for a predator who had used the victim's own trust as a weapon of entry. Every piece of forensic data was now converging on a person who possessed an established, long-term relationship with the victim, someone who knew the layout of her home and the vulnerabilities of her life. This was someone who understood her weekly schedule, someone who knew she would be defenseless and alone, and exactly which psychological buttons to press to get her to open the door at 2 a.m. Law enforcement maintained a state of high tactical silence, making no mention of a person of interest or releasing any details to the media that might tip off the subject of their surveillance. There were no sirens, no dramatic press conferences, and no public naming of names as the agents focused on building an airtight wall of digital evidence that could survive a federal prosecution. This restraint was a calculated necessity. In a case built on volatile digital artifacts, a single leak could cause the suspect to destroy the hardware or remote, wipe the cloud accounts that held the truth. The investigation hummed forward with a quiet, lethal precision, gathering the weight of the evidence needed to crush any potential legal defense the suspect might eventually mount in a courtroom. Simultaneously, a second anomaly was detected in the neighborhood's digital history, uncovered during the FBI's exhaustive sweep of forensic data from the first week of February. Multiple residents in the affluent Catalina Foothills began reporting identical, unexplained technical failures in their personal security infrastructures, including high-end Ring systems and Nest platforms. These smart home devices had all suffered simultaneous outages or significant gaps in their cloud-based recording history during the early morning hours of February 1st, as if the neighborhood had been blinded. The precision of these outages suggested a level of technical sabotage that went far beyond a simple power surge, indicating the presence of a master coordinator who knew exactly how to silence the electronic eyes. The data clusters aligned with clinical precision, mirroring the target area's geography and the predator's exact timing. This blackout focused on Nancy's property, a surgical digital failure hitting multiple neighboring homes during the dead of night. At the exact second her security feed died and she vanished, the entire neighborhood's web failed. Logic dictates this was no coincidence. Detectives viewed this as tactical planning. It suggested a predator who didn't just strike. They engineered a total blackout. This was a technician who grasped the physics of lenses, blind spots, and the digital eyes watching the street. They possessed the hardware expertise to manufacture a void in the server logs at the exact moment of the breach. This localized grid failure became the spine of the federal inquiry, an anomaly that forced a darker assessment of the threat. The central question shifted: how many were involved? Orchestrating a neighborhood-wide blackout is a heavy, multi-person technical lift. A lone actor managing cyber interference while simultaneously handling a physical abduction requires a very specific, high-level criminal profile. The logistics required at her front door, combined with technical jamming, points to a disciplined, perhaps military-grade execution. Federal agents weighed the limits of one human's capacity against the terrifying efficiency documented in the hard forensic evidence. The phone pinging 200 miles away and the synchronized blinding of sensors screamed of a coordinated, lethal conspiracy. The caller ID, the stranger, with Pax 5 meters away, 8 minutes after the feed cut. Every fact was a hunt. Solitary facts are just noise, but together they formed the silhouette of a plan matured over weeks of stalking. This was an architected nightmare, requiring a collaborator with intimate, unfettered access to the inner sanctum of Nancy's routine. The clock didn't start on January 31st. The timeline was pushed back, searching for the first predatory decision ever made. They scrutinized every ping for months, looking for the rhythm leading to that final call at 1:44 a.m. Violent acts don't begin when the power dies. They begin the second someone decides to cross the line. Somewhere in the digital fossils of those choices, agents knew the killer was hiding in plain, documented sight. 70 days passed in a vacuum before the public received a single shred of truth from the authorities. 10 weeks of elite forensic scrubbing and signal analysis tracked a trail of breadcrumbs far outside the Tucson limits. The silence wasn't a failure. It was the sound of a steel trap being meticulously and quietly lubricated. They were drafting a legal death sentence piece by piece, validating every electronic whisper and cell tower handshake they could recover. The image was of a predator who studied her, ate with her, and saw her vulnerability as a viable opportunity. A person she trusted enough to invite to dinner, a person whose name was glowing on her phone screen, someone who dialed her at 1:44 a.m. and listened to the ring, knowing exactly what was about to happen. The cold pressure of a deadbolt sliding into place often provides a false sense of neurological security, masking the predatory reality that the threat is already inside. Trust is not a virtue in a forensic context. It is a high-risk psychological bypass that allows a perpetrator to dismantle a victim's survival instincts through months of calculated performative empathy. This narrative examines the precise moment that chemical handshake of trust is betrayed, forcing a brutal reappraisal of every intimate bond you believe to be secure. Detectives spent 48 hours documenting the atmospheric conditions of the crime scene before noticing the microscopic discrepancy in the dust patterns on the master bedroom floor. The entire trajectory of the investigation pivoted on a single 4-second timestamp recorded by a smart thermostat that contradicted the suspect's meticulously rehearsed alibi. As the final phase of the forensic inquiry concludes, the evidence points toward a conclusion so logically sound, yet so deeply unsettling, that it fundamentally alters the timeline of the crime. The investigation hit a pivot point that shattered local assumptions. 70 days of agony preceded the revelation of the truth. In the Catalina Foothills, life resumed its wealthy pace, oblivious to the federal machinery, grinding toward a final conclusion. Garage doors hummed shut at 10 p.m., while agents sat in windowless rooms, connecting phone pings to a face. This was a slow dissection of a life, performed with a clinical patience that the grieving family couldn't share. For those who loved her, those 70 days were a suffocating fog of unanswered questions and growing visceral terror. Annie's last memory was her mother departing and Tomasa's headlights fading down the driveway into the cold desert night. She fell asleep expecting the morning to hold nothing more than the ordinary rhythm of a typical Arizona Sunday. Once the evidence surfaced, the memory of that last meal and the casual goodbye transformed into something truly grotesque. That is the hard part. The most mundane moments are retroactively stained with the blood of what followed later. A simple goodnight becomes a haunting piece of evidence when viewed through the lens of a planned abduction. Every trivial detail of that Saturday was dragged under the microscope, searching for the telltale sign of betrayal. It wasn't an accusation, but a cold necessity. In an inside job, every proximity is a potential forensic clue. Everyone in that circle had to justify their movements, their silence, and the specific timing of their digital signatures. The Bureau operated with a surgical precision, keeping their cards hidden until the moment the trap was set. The deep dive into call logs yielded a shock, a hidden infrastructure of communication that predated the actual crime. Weeks of archived messages formed a predatory map, a sequence of digital contact that transformed a trusted friend into a hunter. The individual who initiated that call at 1:44 a.m. had been preparing for that moment for weeks. This was no sudden impulse or momentary lapse of reason. The digital forensics proved the architecture of this crime was drafted weeks in advance, and that final communication was merely the hammer falling. That ringtone did not mark the birth of a plan. It was a cold, binary signal, a confirmation that the machinery was in place and the execution phase had officially transitioned to active. This realization forced a violent pivot in the investigation. It meant that throughout the cooling weeks leading up to January 31st, a predator was hiding in plain sight, calculating. While the desert air settled over the foothills and the scent of wood smoke filled the air during ordinary Saturday dinners, a lethal script was being rehearsed in the shadows of polite conversation. Someone situated within the intimate perimeter of Nancy Guthrie's life was maintaining a dual consciousness, smiling across a table while mentally measuring the distance to her front door. They were a ghost in her living room, a student of her vulnerabilities. Detectives channeled this grim reality into a formal briefing for the federal prosecutors, their eyes fixed on a specific objective. The goal was to construct a charging document that transcended the physical violence of February 1st. They needed to encapsulate the cold, calculated psychological architecture that supported the act. It wasn't just about the blood on the floor. It was about the oxygen-starved environment of a conspiracy that had been breathing for months before the first wound was ever inflicted. Federal conspiracy statutes are weaponized specifically for these scenarios. They treat the final act as the inevitable terminus of a long, dark corridor of choices made in suburban silence. The evidence was a digital anatomy, call logs, GPS coordinates, the intentional blackout of security cameras, the rhythmic data from a pacemaker, and a phone pinging 200 miles away. No single data point carried the weight alone. They were interlocking gears, and as the prosecution assembled the mechanism, the cold logic of the betrayal became undeniable. This was no longer a collection of reports. It was a forensic biography of a murder, a chronological map that tracked every heartbeat and every keystroke leading to the door. Every second was accounted for, every movement timestamped, creating a locked-room reality of how the betrayal was engineered and exactly who held the remote. The 70 days of silence from the authorities wasn't a sign of hesitation. It was the silence of a sniper taking aim, waiting for the exact moment when the case reached absolute density. They refused to move until the evidence was hardened for the sterile, high-stakes environment of a federal trial. Every digital record had to be bulletproof and authenticated. Every millisecond of the timeline was verified by multiple sources, and every geographic coordinate was triangulated against independent datasets to ensure there was zero room for a defense to breathe. The weight of the digital footprint was massive, but the true strength of the case lay in the gruesome harmony between the invisible data and the physical reality of the scene. The cooling blood on the porch steps matched the timing of the camera's sudden blindness. The man found 5 miles away was linked to the scene by intent and radio waves. The 911 call, frantic and desperate, contained zero contradictions when measured against the cold, unfeeling data harvested from the devices. This is a corroborated reality. Every lead and every scrap of data funneled back to a single, devastating origin point. At the center of this web sat that 1:44 a.m. phone call. The number was no mystery. It was a familiar name in Nancy's contacts, a person whose cell phone pings placed them within a lethal radius of her home. By the time the handcuffs were ready, the FBI hadn't just reconstructed a homicide. They had mapped the anatomy of a betrayal, tracing the precise contours of a lifelong connection. They documented the specific, high-level trust that acted as the killer's primary weapon, the kind of bond that allows someone to walk past a deadbolt without a second thought. Nancy Guthrie had no reason to fear this person. Their history was a ledger of shared meals, decades of familiarity, and the security that comes from years of proven loyalty. Saturday nights had a rhythm that had remained unchanged for years, ending with the porch light and a wave, until the night that rhythm was shattered by a predetermined silence. When the authorities finally moved, There were no flashing lights for the evening news or theatrical grandstanding. In the federal system, the process is as quiet as the crime was loud. The focus remained clinical, protecting the integrity of the evidence and ensuring the coming legal battle would be fought on a field of pure, unadulterated facts. Beyond the legalities, the arrest served as a cold answer to the terror that had gripped the Catalina Foothills for months. The monster wasn't in the bushes, it was in the phone book. The community's question was finally answered, not with a name they didn't know, but with a betrayal they couldn't have imagined in their worst nightmares. The caller at 1:44 a.m. wasn't some lurking stranger. They were an intimate participant in Nancy's life, someone who knew where she kept her spare keys and her secrets. This was someone she had invited in, someone she had shared coffee with, someone who had earned the most dangerous thing you can give a person, your trust. For the investigators, that trust wasn't just a detail, it was the tactical advantage the killer used to bypass every defense and every locked door. This case resonates because it attacks the foundation of how we perceive safety. It's not about a random act of violence in a dark alley. It is about the specific horror of being targeted by the person who knows you best, the person who understands exactly how to hurt you. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old, a woman who had spent 8 decades building a world based on the assumption that her inner circle was her sanctuary. The psychological profile of the suspect reveals a terrifying ability to compartmentalize, to maintain a mask of normalcy while the internal clock ticked toward a violent conclusion. This is a clinical examination of the fragility of the human social contract and the predatory darkness that can thrive behind a friendly face. Forensic analysts spent hundreds of hours looking at the data, but the most unsettling evidence remained: the sheer absence of empathy required to execute such a plan. As the investigation reached its final stage, one question remained for everyone who had watched the events unfold from the safety of their own homes. There is a ghost timeline of January 31st, 2026, a version of history where the natural order of the universe remained intact and undisturbed. In that world, Nancy Guthrie enters her home at 9:48 p.m., the heavy garage door sealing her inside a familiar, safe environment at 9:50 p.m. She follows her nightly routine, taking her medication as the clock ticks toward 10, while across town, Annie prepares for a quiet Sunday morning coffee and a call. That peaceful reality, built on decades of predictable love, existed with total certainty until the exact microsecond the plan was activated. That is the jagged edge that haunts the mind long after the court dates are set. It's the sheer proximity of safety to total destruction. It wasn't the complexity of the digital encryption or the scale of the surveillance that mattered. It was the simple, cold fact of a choice. It wasn't just the clinical precision of the camera blackout or the phone logs. It was the killer at Nancy Guthrie's table, someone who knew her voice and her private contacts, making a cold, deliberate choice to kill her. This became a landmark Tucson case not because of its complexity, but because of the unsettling betrayal it exposed. It revealed the terrifying space between trust and violence, showing how routines intended for safety are turned against us. The investigation mapped how the people we rely on can meticulously study our lives to find a lethal opening. Nancy was no public figure. She was an 84-year-old grandmother living a quiet, predictable life in the desert. Her Saturdays were built around visiting her daughter, taking hired cars because navigating traffic had become too difficult. She moved through her home with a walker, maintaining a small but fiercely guarded world of family and routine. Her narrow circle gave the perpetrator the perfect tactical advantage. Federal agents documented a method of predatory infiltration. The evidence suggests a strategy that begins not with a forced entry, but with the quiet accumulation of intelligence. The killer studied her schedule, her medications, and her physical vulnerabilities from inside the safety of her own home. This was the slow-motion execution of a plan by a trusted insider, who knew every creak of the floorboards. That 1:44 a.m. call was the signal. It wasn't just a phone record, it was the final betrayal. Trust was maintained for months, for the sole purpose of weaponizing it at the exact moment she was most vulnerable. Pacemaker telemetry tracked 41 minutes of data. A frantic emergency call placed a distressed woman in a moving vehicle. The car traveled 200 meters into the foothills. Simultaneously, security cameras across the entire neighborhood went dark. A man with heavy backpacks was spotted 5 miles away, moving with a singular predatory purpose through the night. Every data point suggests a hit planned with clinical patience, not a moment of sudden rage or financial desperation. The perpetrator used their access with terrifying calm, waiting for the precise window to execute their long-term strategy. Federal charges are heavy. The FBI spent 70 days in silence, building a case to survive every legal challenge. They constructed a forensic vault designed to withstand aggressive cross-examination and the inevitable appeals that follow such arrests. The legal machine is moving. The call records, GPS data, and digital forensics form a mountain of corroborated evidence. This is the most thoroughly documented crime in regional history, leaving no room for doubt about the killer's identity. For Annie and Tommaso, the trial offers no real comfort. They are left with the trauma of that night. No verdict can resolve the horror of knowing a predator sat at their dinner table just hours before the end. The memory of that last meal, the conversation, and the drive home is now permanently stained by the violence that followed. This psychological weight is the part of the story that never appears in federal filings or official police reports. Nancy Guthrie was 84. She was a woman who managed her own life and trusted her community implicitly. She scheduled her own rides and built her week around the quiet confidence that her friends were truly friends. That confidence wasn't a weakness, yet it provided the killer with the perfect blueprint for a cold-blooded assassination. On January 31st, 2026, she was targeted not for her mistakes, but for her predictable kindness. Her death was the result of a calculated choice made by someone she had welcomed into her private world. Every recovery record and timestamp stands as a counter to the idea that such crimes can ever be hidden. The phone rang at 1:44 in the morning, a digital signature that eventually led the FBI to the source. Tracing that call changed the entire trajectory of the investigation, exposing the darkness hiding within Nancy's very small circle. Investigators focused on the psychological profile of an individual capable of such prolonged, intimate deception before the final strike. The clinical nature of the crime suggests a predator who feels no empathy, only the cold satisfaction of a plan. Forensic specialists continue to analyze the digital echoes left behind, ensuring that every second of her final journey is accounted. This case remains a grim reminder of how easily the walls of our sanctuary can be breached from the inside. The data points tell a story of a life stolen by someone who traded human connection for a lethal opportunity. Justice moves slowly, but the evidence gathered in those 70 days of silence is an inescapable weight for the accused.